Good afternoon and welcome to the Nurse Leadership Forum Middle East. I'm Brandy Scott and I'm going to be leading you through our seminar today. This afternoon, we're going to look at essential strategies for nurse leadership. We'll be speaking about compassion, about clinical effectiveness, and about preventing burnout. Now, I don't need to remind any of you how extraordinary the times are in which we are doing this, but if you will bear with me, I do want to start by sharing a couple of statistics from two studies that have been released in the last 72 hours. The first is from the International Council of Nurses. It came out this weekend. They have found that 70%, that's 70, of national nursing associations are currently very concerned about the mental health pressure on their nurses. Meanwhile, the National French Nursing Union has surveyed around 60,000 of its nurses. It reports that more than half are close to burning out. 20% haven't taken any time off since March. And clearly, this is also a topic of concern here in the UAE. And we can tell that by how many of you have signed up today. We were expecting around 200 nurses on this call, and instead we're welcoming nearly 1,500 of you, which is fantastic. But it also shows how important this discussion is. And by the way, we also know that all 1,500 of you are extremely busy. So let me quickly tell you how today is going to work. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to hear from 7 nurse leaders from across the UAE, sharing what they have learnt and what they have done in the past 8 months when it comes to supporting their staff. We're also lucky enough to hear from 2 keynote speakers. The positive psychology expert, Professor Kieran O'Doyle, and he is joining us from Dublin, and the Associate Professor Jane Griffiths, who many of you will know. She was recently the Chief Nursing Information Officer at the Dubai Health Authority. Now, this initiative has been conceived by OBIX Middle East, which is a business with clinicians at its heart. OBIX is a perinatal system used in more than 700 hospitals and 25% of all births in the US. OBIX came to the Middle East a couple of years ago, 2017, and they've got a permanent staff here implementing their system into hospitals with labour and delivery units. And the reason that they are doing this today, well, a big part of the OBIX philosophy is helping to educate and support nurses in all their roles, which is what today's event is designed to do. We want to remind you that you're not alone, but part of a much wider community. And we want that community to share its experiences, draw on each other's strengths, and continue to build hope in these tough times. I just have to say a quick thank you, speaking of, to the 27 senior nurses on our Nurse Leadership Forum Middle East Steering Group who have guided us on the topics that we will be discussing today and the need for this event. A quick bit of housekeeping. We are going to keep this seminar to under 2 hours for you. We will be out promptly at 5 o'clock. This platform that we're using today is powered by Informer, and it will allow you to submit questions throughout the event. If you want to put those to Jane and Kieran, there is a Q&A box in the left, at the bottom left side of your screen. And please, this platform is pretty new to us as well. Everyone's been on a steep technical learning curve this year. So I'm going to ask you in advance to forgive us the odd technical snafu. And with that, let us just get on with it. I am very pleased to introduce our first speaker. Joining us from Dublin, Professor Kieran O'Doyle. Kieran is a Professor of Psychology at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and he's founding director of the RSCI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. In fact, he actually established the very first department of psychology in any Irish medical school back in 1985. He's also the founding director of the RCSI Institute of Leadership. He lectures and publishes extensively, and unsurprisingly, he is in high demand. So we're very pleased to have him with us on this call today. Kieran, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brandy, for that very kind introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. I've spent a lot of my time going back and forth to the Middle East, so I should also say salam alaikum to many of you. I'm coming to you from the Centre for Positive Psychology here at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. And, you know, I'd like to start by offering our support and, you know, recognizing the remarkable work that you are doing and the enormous challenges of the particular time we all find ourselves in. This really is a very odd time. We did a webinar recently which we called the new normal, and I've decided that's not a term that I'm going to use anymore, because I don't think there's anything normal about what's going on. So I want to be very practical today, and I'm going to talk about a number of things. I want to talk about the COVID-19 stressors, particularly as they relate to nursing. I want to talk about coping strategies, and I also want to talk specifically about leadership and the type of leadership that's needed in this time. So let's start by talking about COVID-19. And we really have started to see the emergence of some good research now. And that research started in Wuhan soon after the beginning of the epidemic there. Research on the impact of this epidemic on the mental and physical health of frontline staff. And as I've said here, as nurses caring for COVID-19 patients, you're vulnerable not only to the risk of infection, so there's a whole set of vulnerabilities there, but also to the impact of a variety of stressors that can result in mental health challenges. And of course, the type of stressors depend on you, on your circumstances, on your own work situation, and also the phase of the pandemic that we're in. And clearly the phase keeps on changing, so we're moving in and out of different phases. And there's a significant degree of uncertainty here, which I think is making it more difficult to deal with the psychological aspects of this. The Director General of the WHO said that we're dealing not just with an epidemic, but we're also dealing with a pandemic, an infodemic of information overload. So to introduce a few caveats to this and what we're going to talk about, the first is, as I've said, I don't think these are normal times. I think everybody is affected in one way or another. I think that everybody responds differently, so it's very hard to have a catch-all set of coping strategies. I think in terms of resilience, there aren't any easy answers. I think this is a battle, and I think it's a challenge. In psychological terms, it's becoming clear for most of us in most countries that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. We're in this for some time. And we have been discussing here in Ireland with our government the need for a different type of psychological strategy now, because when we locked down first in March, that was very new and very novel. Things were going well, now things are not going so well, and people are tired and they're finding it more difficult to have to re-engage again with all of this and to have to start re-engaging with restrictions. And then the final thing I would say is I really do think you're your own best expert. You know yourself best. You're best positioned to work out what works for you, what's best for you. So please take what I'm saying. I'm going to be speaking in fairly general terms. Please take what works for you or what might work for you, and just ignore the rest of it. I've pulled together here the kinds of issues that health professionals, including nurses, have been identifying as stressors. So working under extreme pressure, and particularly with reduced staffing resources, anxiety about patients, of course, having to make difficult decisions, the fear of infection and the fear of infecting one's own family, that's an additional stressor for health professionals. Having to provide care for unwell patients, particularly if the resources are inadequate. Many health professionals have had to work outside their normal scope of practice, and that in itself is a challenge. Risking moral injury, and let me say a little bit more about that in just a moment. And then just looking after yourself, balancing your own physical and mental health care needs with those of your patients. Aligning your duty with those of family and friends, and then the usual financial concerns and financial stressors and so on. So there's a whole variety of potential stressors in this situation that add to the normal stressors that already exist within the caring professions. Moral injury is a particular risk in this situation. Moral injury refers to the psychological distress that results from actions, or the lack of them, which violates someone's moral or ethical code. And this can be quite a serious issue, where for a variety of reasons, including lack of resources, decisions are made which the person feels are not the right decision, that they feel violate their ethical or moral code. And there's quite a big research literature on this as a stressor in healthcare. If you experience something like that, it can lead to feelings of anger, shame, guilt, disgust, depression. And there are some reports of that having led for some health professionals even to suicidal ideation, to think about tragically about ending their lives. So I'm going to come back around to that, because I think that's something that maybe sits in the background a bit, and we need to just take it out and talk about it. Okay. So there, from the research literature that's emerged in recent times looking at COVID, there are sort of three big key ideas about coping. This is from a really good piece that was written by Brooks in the British Medical Journal, the military section in July of this month, Psychological Resilience and Post-Traumatic Growth in Disaster-Exposed Organizations. So this is highly relevant for us. And I've used that term post-traumatic growth there, and I'll come back around and say something more about that in a little while. So here's what the research is telling us, that if your pre-outbreak training is designed to allow you to perform your job effectively and competently, you cope better when you're faced with stressors or with challenges. The second finding is that your resilience is significantly enhanced by having good support from family, from loved ones, from colleagues, from managers. And I was recently doing a webinar to doctors in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and one of the things they spoke about was the extent to which the workload and the kind of rosters were interfering with their family lives and the difficulties they had in balancing those. So it's incredibly important, in as much as possible, to try to maintain one's social network. And that is difficult, given that social isolation is one of the major strategies for preventing spread. And then we come to the third of these, and this is what we're going to spend a bit of time talking about now, and that is the idea of using a proactive mindset. And I'll explain what a mindset is. It's really about, a proactive mindset is about taking charge in a situation, trying to be as proactive as possible, accepting the situation, and allowing yourself to face into traumatic thoughts. We know that this is what makes us more resilient. Now, let's just deal in a little bit more detail with what a mindset is. I'm demonstrating this here by showing water here flowing through a wadi. And mindsets are really lenses through which we simplify enormous quantities of information about the world and about ourselves. So it's the mental models that we use, and it's the way we think about things. And just as water flows through the contours of the wadi here, our thinking flows through the contours of our mindsets. And that can be a problem, because that can limit our thinking. We can become very narrow in our thinking. So one of the ways of coping effectively and being more resilient is to start to look at and then to change our mindsets. Now, how do we do that? Well, let's look at a number of strategies that we can use to change mindsets. The first is to talk about what's called a growth mindset. Now, this is a book I'm showing you on the left here by a wonderful psychologist called Carl Dweck. And for any of you who are interested in this, and for any of you who have young people at home, teenagers and young people, teach them about mindsets. I've seen this being done now in schools in Australia and various other countries. Teaching children about growth mindset is incredibly effective in helping them to deal with vulnerability. So a mindset here is really the way we engage with challenge. A fixed mindset, I engage with challenge by saying, well, the challenge is difficult for me. I'm not going to be up to this. If I make a mistake, I beat myself up. I have a sense that what determines how well I cope with the challenge is what my abilities are, my talents, and so on. That's how a fixed mindset works. A growth mindset is very different. When we have a growth mindset, and we're presented with a difficult problem, we engage with the problem and we start thinking about how we are going to deal with the challenge, how we're going to learn. We know that we mightn't get it right every time or even the first time, but we're prepared to try and we're prepared to learn. As I'm showing you there on the side, people who adopt a growth mindset will put in the extra time and effort to understand why they failed. They rebound more quickly from setbacks. Those with fixed mindsets believe that their successes and failures are just tied to their own personal identities. Now, here's the wonderful thing about this. We know from a great deal of research that we can change our mindsets from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. We can also help our teams do that, and really important, we can help our children to do that, to move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. How do you develop a growth mindset? Well, you embrace challenges. You persist in the face of setbacks. You see the effort that you have to make as part of the journey to achievement. You're open to learning from criticism. You take criticism as a way of helping you to see how you might move forward. You look to see what others are doing, and particularly people who are resilient, and you learn from them. And the last one here is very important for health professionals. Some lovely recent research to show that health professionals who can kind of key into the vocational aspects of their calling. Why did you become a nurse? Why did you become a health professional? Wanting to help people, wanting to be an expert, wanting to give, wanting to show kindness. People who kind of remind themselves and tap into that sense of calling or vocation or whatever you want to call it, they are much more resilient and much less likely to burn out in difficult or challenging situations, such as those that we're finding ourselves in now. Now, I don't have time to get into this in detail, but this is a lovely piece of work done in Stanford University. It's called the Stanford Rethink Stress Intervention. I've put the website link up there. And basically, this is using mindset thinking to change the way we engage with stress. 3 parts of this. The first is to acknowledge our stress, and that is to identify what's stressing us right now, physiologically, emotionally, and behaviorally. And what's really interesting about that sort of shifts our thinking away from just an emotional response, using the emotional part of the brain, the limbic system, to using our prefrontal cortex, which is where we do planning. So by analyzing how we're responding, we're already changing how we're engaging with the stressor. The second part is to own the stress, and that's identifying the meaning of this particular situation for me. Why is it that I'm finding this particularly stressful? Laddering down to what the reasons are. I might be over-identifying with a patient, I might be projecting, there might be a whole variety of, I might be feeling vulnerable, and so on. And then the third idea is to then use the stress energy to try to achieve more effectively. Now, it's more difficult to do than it sounds, but Stanford have developed a freely available course that you can log on and do on their website. And the research evidence behind this is really, really good. I'd highly recommend that program, that course. I want to say a little bit more about burnout and meaning and purpose. Burnout is a real challenge because very often by the time we get burnt out, it can be a little bit late. So again, we know that one of the ways of preventing burnout is to have a very strong sense of meaning in life, and particularly meaning in our work. Health professionals who have a sense of calling and who kind of cue back into the meaning of their work, that ability to do that is one of the great bulwarks against burnout. So finding meaning is a really important part of this mindset approach. The third part of the mindset approach that I want to talk about is this idea of working out what we call your signature strengths are. Now, we very often focus on what we're not good at. Human beings are kind of constructed that we're much more aware of the negative things in life. When we get feedback, we pay more attention to the negatives than to the positives. This is a fantastic way of actually starting to change that mindset. This is from a group called VIA in Cincinnati. They're a research organization. They're philanthropic. They have done a huge amount of research on human strengths. And you can log on there. I've given you the website. It's called viacharacter.org. And there's a questionnaire there, 220 questions, and you can identify in rank order your strengths from 1 to 24. Now, they've spent about 5 years, 50 scientists going around the world establishing what strengths people have. So signature strengths are your top 4 or 5 strengths. These are strengths that you feel represent the real you. If you're asked what your strengths are, it feels real. You feel excited when you discover and use these strengths. You excel at them very quickly. You feel that the strength is a particular aspect of you that's core. You learn very quickly when you use that particular strength. You want to find new ways of using it, and generally you feel energized. So for me, one of my strengths, and obviously you're going to be high on some and low on others, and I'm low on lots of them, but one of my strengths is love of learning. So that really fits as a signature strength for me. You know, I feel it represents the real me. I like using the strength, and so on. The website is superb, great deal of good, solid, well-grounded information, a lot of advice on how to identify and use your strengths. So again, as a mindset approach, really, really valuable. There's a version of this for children from 10 to 17. And we know that one of the ways of countering the development of stress and anxiety and depression in young people is to have them to think about their strengths. So in a nutshell, here's what to do. Identify your strengths, go onto the website, identify your strengths, then start to become much more aware of your strengths when you're dealing with the current challenge. Use your top 5 strengths as much as you can. Be aware of other people's complementary strengths, particularly on a team. People will have strengths that you don't have. And then if you're in a management or leadership position, make room for people to use the strengths that they're particularly strong on. So incredibly valuable, very solid research. Now, we've used the term post-traumatic growth, so I just want to explain a little bit about what that is. We know a lot about post-traumatic stress, and we tend to focus a lot on post-traumatic stress. And there's a lot of good data and research and clinical interventions available there. But a lot of people who face trauma or have dealt with traumatic situations find that it changes their lives in a positive way. They become much more aware of what they have. They value parts of their lives that they mightn't have valued so much before. They become much more aware about the importance of their relationships, for example. And this has led in the last 10 years or so to a research in positive psychology on what's called post-traumatic growth. And this is a kind of a different way of thinking about post-trauma responses. The American military, for example, have initiated a huge program training all of their troops and officers in post-traumatic growth. So the principles are that we try to understand how we're responding or have responded to a particular traumatic situation. We use techniques to reduce anxiety. We use constructive self-disclosure. So I do think a lot about what the event meant to me, what the situation meant to me. And I try to create a narrative from that is a growth narrative rather than a depression or a fixed narrative. And then I try to see the extent to which the situation contributes to my understanding of life's principles. So a good example here would be having seen death, for example, close up, or having seen trauma close up, particularly in COVID times. I start to see, can I educate myself more about how I appreciate my own life, appreciate the others around me, appreciate my social connections. And many of you will probably be familiar with the real value here of the Schwartz rounds in hospital settings, structured situations where people can come together after an emotionally demanding set of circumstances and articulate how they feel about that and what that has meant. Moral injury is something that we are concerned with, those of us on the mental health side of this. We know that early, frank information and discussion about difficult situations or difficult cases is important. We know that it's very important for supervisors to support their teams. A very good technique I've seen is a very quick post-shift huddle where the shift comes together briefly and just discusses what happened and their responses to that. We need regular contact to discuss decisions and check on people's well-being. And then active monitoring of people, of your teams, and providing support where necessary using evidence-based treatments. So we know that moral injury is a risk, but we know that the key to managing it is really good support and really good communication, particularly from colleagues and from supervisors. Now, finally, then, I just want to talk briefly about leadership. And we could spend weeks on this, but I thought it would be helpful just to bring you one model that we used in the Institute of Leadership for 15 years with thousands of health professionals through training in this. And this is called authentic leadership. We know it works. We know it has a very profound effect on the people being led. And there are really 4 components to authentic leadership in terms of how you develop it. The first is self-knowledge. People who are authentic leaders and who are effective at this kind of leadership have spent a great deal of time getting to know themselves. They do a lot of self-reflection. They do a lot of self-development. You know, they know what their strengths are. They know what their areas for development are. So good leadership starts with self-leadership. It starts with working on one's own understanding of oneself. So that's the first part. The second part is that authentic leadership is really about doing the right thing, ethically or morally correct thing, not the expedient thing or not the easiest thing, the right thing. And that requires of leaders that you become aware of what your values are. You think about your values, as I'm sure many of you do. You think about your values and you link your behavior to your values. And that's tremendous trust, because the people following you don't have to second guess you. They'll know that you will behave appropriately in relation to what your values are. You develop a genuineness. It's called authentic leadership for a reason. People, when they see you, they see the real person. You're not a different person in a whole lot of different circumstances. You're authentic and you're compassionate. There's some amazing research now emerging on compassion. Empathy is when we feel somebody else is suffering. We feel with them. Now, the problem with that is empathy in itself is very stressful for the person feeling it. If you add the second part, which is compassion, that means you're taking action to help the other who you're empathizing with. And recent research is showing that the parts of the brain that light up when we're being compassionate are different from the parts of the brain that light up when we're just being empathetic. Compassion stimulates reward systems in the brain, dopaminergic systems. So compassionate empathy is very positive for the person on the receiving end, but it's also really valuable for the giver of compassion. And within that, we really, really need to learn to be compassionate to ourselves. Very often in healthcare, we're not sufficiently compassionate to ourselves. And then the final part of authentic leadership is fairness, balanced processing, being fair-minded. You as a leader will have an agenda and a set of needs. Your people will have their agendas and sets of needs, and there will be needs of the situation. What authentic leaders do is they try to balance those three sets of needs. It's not that they push to have their own way or their own agenda or their own needs met without regard to others or without regard to the situation. They develop the ability to balance their needs with the needs of others and an understanding of the needs of the situation. Because we're a bit limited in time, I can't go into detail on a lot of this. We've put together on our website at the RCSI, the Royal College of Surgeons, a whole range of support materials. They're available to anybody who wants them on various aspects of dealing with the COVID crisis. So I'd invite you, please feel free, jump onto the website, go to our coronavirus hub on the website, and you'll find a whole raft of materials there. So in supporting your own team's well-being, I think good quality communication, absolutely essential. Rotating workers from high stress to low stress functions. Putting inexperienced people together with more experienced colleagues. Monitor work breaks and so on. Ensure that staff know and can access mental health and psychological support services. And all of these apply to you, the manager, the individual as well. I'm going to finish with two final slides, and these kind of summarize my philosophy in relation to this. There's nothing new here. This has been around for a very long time. I've become very interested recently in the philosophy of the Stoics. The Stoics were a group of philosophers who were around 2,000 years ago in Greece and in Rome. This is Epictetus, who was one of the great Stoic philosophers. And this is what Epictetus said, and it's as relevant for us in dealing with COVID as it was 2,000 years ago. He said, the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where do I then look for good or evil? Not to the uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own. So we're all dealing with difficult situation at the moment. We need to look inward, and we need to take control over the elements that we can control and not worry too much about the externals. What made Epictetus able to say this? Epictetus ended up running one of the great schools of philosophy in Athens, but he was born a slave, and for 30 years, he was a slave with an extremely nasty owner who, when he was a child, just as he could do it, his master broke his leg. So Epictetus walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And he came to this philosophy through his own experience of being a slave. Control what you can, even the small things. Don't worry so much about the things you can't control. And my final slide is from appropriately enough, an Irish poet and writer, the great John O'Donoghue, who sadly died about 5 or 6 years ago. And John said this, and I think it's a wonderful note to end on. He says, each person is the sole inhabitant of their own inner world. Each of us is responsible for how we see and what we see. The heart of vision is shaped by the state of the soul. When the soul is alive to beauty, we begin to see life in a fresh and vital way. The old habits of seeing are broken. The dead dust falls from the windows, and the elements of one's life reveal new urgency and possibility. So yes, it's difficult, yes, it's tough, but there are new elements of possibility here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kieran. And I'm going to have a few questions with Kieran now, some that have come in from the audience and some that I've been jotting down while you have been speaking. One of the things I am really interested in, Kieran, is the ongoing nature of this pandemic and how that affects the mindset that you're talking about there, because this isn't an event like 9/11 that happens and we deal with the fallout. This is something that we were hoping would be over by the summer, and then people were talking about the end of the year, and now people are questioning things in mid-2021. What effect does that have on stress levels and the way we perceive and deal with things like this?
I think that's a great question, Brandy. And, you know, normally when something traumatic is happening, you can see an end in sight. So it's time limited, as you say. With this, there's a significant degree of unpredictability and uncertainty. And countries who thought that they had this under control are now finding that it's back with a vengeance. So that's the reality for all of us. And as humans, we don't really cope all that well with uncertainty and unpredictability. It makes things more stressful. So there's a couple of things here. I think we have to accept that that's the situation. If we go to the Stoics, that's what they would say. That's the situation we're in. We then have to decide how we're going to respond to that. How are we going to choose the mindset that we deal with that? So I think a good idea is to say, yes, we're in it for the long haul. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Okay, that's the reality. Now, what can I control? What do I have autonomy? And that can be small things. You know, I can still choose, you know, when I get up, what I have for breakfast. I can choose the clothes I'm going to wear. I can choose to some degree the people I'm going to see. I can choose how I'm going to engage. So it's really important psychologically for us to keep a sense of control, even over the smallest things, because an awful lot of this we simply can't control. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is it's incredibly important for people to maintain their social networks, even if they use technology to do that. And particularly for Middle East culture. Now, I know there are a lot of expats working in the Middle East, but for Middle East culture itself, which I'm reasonably familiar with, family is incredibly important there. I mean, you know, and keeping those relationships and keeping that going. And then I think the other unusual thing about this particular crisis, and it's probably the first major event of the 21st century, really. This is something that will be looked back on in history as the start of the 21st century. It's happening to everybody. We are right across the world. We are all in this together. And I think there's some comfort in that. It's, if you're feeling low and you're feeling bad and you're feeling stressed, millions and millions and millions of people are feeling exactly the same. We are not alone in this. It's incredibly challenging for everybody.
You mentioned the way that COVID will be looked at in history books. What about by your own profession? You've run through some research there, but what do you expect this pandemic to teach us? 8 or 9 months in, what's your sense of what psychology will learn from it?
It's a very good question. I think what psychology is learning is, you know, we work in a particular branch of psychology called positive psychology. It's really only emerged in the last 20 years. And one of the really important things about positive psychology is it's scientific, it's evidence-based. So I think what's happening here is very quickly, because of the scale of this pandemic, we can find out pretty quickly what works for people's mental health and what doesn't work. So one of the places where psychology will benefit is that we'll know a lot more about what's actually effective and what's not effective. So that's one bit of it. I think we are looking at an epidemic of mental health issues here. I know in this country, for example, in the UK, we were working with Brazil recently, the United States. One of the great challenges from this is going to be grief and bereavement, because the way people die during this pandemic is appalling, and the way funerals take place and the difficulties for people in sort of grieving properly loved ones whom they haven't seen. So we know we're going to see the mental health consequences of this running on even after the physical pandemic itself is over. And I think one of the things we're learning in psychology is we need to gear up for that. I think we're learning that it's extremely important to help children to cope with this, because if it's unpredictable for adults, it's very unpredictable for children. So how we talk to children, how we engage with them, how we allow children to express their fears and their anxieties, that's becoming extremely important. And there's a lot of good psychology around that.
My last question for you, Kieran, before we move on, and don't worry everybody, Kieran's not going anywhere, he's staying with us. You can enter your questions for him down in the bottom left-hand portion of the screen. Two questions I'm joining together that we've got in from two nursing leaders this morning. How do you best motivate and encourage staff who might be scared at the moment? And how is best to show your appreciation for the work that they're doing?
Okay, and they're two really great questions. Well, any nurse leader, I think, learns over time how to motivate staff and how to look after them. So I think leaders have to be confident in the strategies and the approaches that they already use. I mean, the same kinds of strategies are going to work in this situation. But I think there's a couple of things. There's a fantastic book by Monica Worling and Jane Dutton recently published called Compassion at Work. And they've produced a new model of how to be compassionate with your people. And their view, and I think they have very good research to back it up, would be that suffering is often invisible. People often suffer quietly, and you may not be aware that they're suffering. So the first part of this is a significant increase in one's sensitivity that one's people might be suffering. And it could be that they've gone more silent. It could be that they're reacting to stress in a more aggressive way, whatever it is. So the first part is keying into that. And then the second part is being helpful. I think that the emotional tone of leadership at the moment is more important than it's ever been. And I think there are a set of new stressors that I think are difficult and challenging to deal with. So I think motivation, communication is key to it. The team huddles, making sure that there's time out. In Wuhan, when they asked health professionals, frontline health professionals, what did they need and what could the hospitals do, they were expecting a whole lot of psychological strategies to be suggested. What people suggested was, we need somewhere to sleep, we need food, and provide us with breakout spaces where we can simply get away and get our heads out of this. So it was the really practical things. And that's not really all that surprising, because if you go back to Maslow, our needs are physiological first, then we have security needs, and then we have belonging needs. So again, for someone in a leadership position, looking after the basics is extremely important. Anything a leader can do to show his or her team that they care, that they empathize, that they take action, that they're compassionate, works in terms of maintaining morale.
Professor Karen O'Boyle speaking to us from Dublin, Professor of Psychology at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. We're going to move now locally. Our first local nurse leader that we're going to hear from today is Brenda Flynn. She's the Chief Nursing Officer at Danat Al Emirat Hospital in Abu Dhabi, and she is going to share what they have done to protect the mental health of their nursing staff.
I'm Brenda Flynn. I'm the Chief Nursing Officer at Danat Al Emirat Hospital for Women and Children based in Abu Dhabi. I've been a nurse for a long time. I've been in the UAE since 2008. So we had a cohort of nurses there. What do they do? So we had to train them up to go out and do swabbing on adults. And some of them have not looked after an adult since they qualified, basically. So yeah, it was a big change. But they actually all really enjoyed it. Surprisingly so. I mean, some of the places they went to were way out in the desert in the western region, that they would get the bus and then they would have to get jeeps over the sand dunes basically to get to the camps. And we'd get all these videos back, and but the smiles on their faces, even when they were doing 16, 17-hour days because of the travel, amazing teamwork going on. I really have to give credit to the nurses for that. I mean, we're lucky because the bigger group, UE Medical, actually has psychologists and psychiatrists on staff. So the group as a whole put on fairly regular Zoom mental health sessions, if you like, where the staff could all come together to talk about their experiences, if they had any issues. Also on site, through our occupational health, we actually are able to refer staff to either the psychiatrist or the psychologist to give them that support, should they wish it. Not all of them do, but if they don't wish it, then it's just a system of being able to sit down. I mean, just this morning, actually, I've had a nurse in my office for almost an hour, because she's distressed now. not because of the COVID situation in the country, but because she can't get back to see her family. And I think that's the issue we're facing now. It's not necessarily now because they're at risk, although there is still risk out there, obviously, but it's the inability to see family. That's the biggest problem now, I think. To try and maintain the service, especially when we start to see record-breaking numbers, but we've actually got reduced manpower, has been very challenging. All levels came together. So we had a COVID task force in the hospital that met at the beginning every single day. And I mean every single day. 7 days a week we met. And some of those meetings would go on for 2 or 3 hours, planning what should we do, where should we do. And it was a multidisciplinary team. It wasn't just the executive team. You know, it was the heads of department. You know, it was the heads of like the nurse manager for the operating room, the nurse manager for the emergency department, and everything. Everybody came together and everybody had equal rights. And through that, there was quite a robust way of communicating out the decisions to the staff. Nurse leaders have to show compassion for their staff. So if you become tired and burnt out, you can't support them in what they're doing. Yes, it's been tiring. Yes, like I said, you know, the COVID task force was meeting 7 days a week, you know, for probably a period of 3 or 4 months. I was working 7 days a week, you know, and because it wasn't just a task force meeting, that would then go into something else, that would go into something else, that would go into something else. You know, the days weren't a nice 9.5-hour days that we normally work. You know, it was starting at 7, you know, your last meeting might be at 9 o'clock at night. So it was tiring, yeah, you know, but I quite enjoyed that, to be honest. Maybe I'm just a strange person, I don't know, but I quite enjoyed that, that busyness and that, you know, being able to make decisions quickly and having a team. I mean, I have a great team of nurse managers around me, I have to say. You know, they're very respectful and responsible. Like I said, my deputy went off and did this swabbing. No people, I mean, she's a midwife by background, so what's it got to do with her role? Nothing. It's about not having this big divide between I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse. It's about working together. Yes, there's still a little bit of that, but I think that this really showed the value of nurses. And I think that's the biggest thing. And I think that the world, if not the country, if not the organisation, has to now realise that without nurses, there is no healthcare. And nurses were at the core of this. I think that's the biggest lesson that everybody needs to learn. And if you don't value nurses, you've got no healthcare left.
Thank you. That is Brenda Flynn, Chief Nursing Officer at Danat Al Emirat Hospital in Abu Dhabi. Our next speaker is Sarah Elias, Chief Nursing Officer at Aster Hospitals, speaking to us about the importance of keeping morale high at the moment amongst nursing staff.
My name, of course, Sarah Elias, and right now I am holding a position of Chief Nursing Officer in Aster Hospital. It was very important and a big challenge to keep the morale and the motivation of the nurses up high and give them that assurance and that trust that the organization will not put you in the front line by jeopardizing your safety. I think that was a time where emotionally I saw my nurses gained a lot of strength, a lot of a lot of encouragement that, you know, this is a time where, you know, nobody else is valued as much as now nursing fraternity is valued. So positive thing, if you ask me, I think over the decades, at least from the time that I've become a nurse, I've not seen this much significance resonating around nursing. So I'll tell you, one of the challenges that we discovered during the COVID time was the psychological support and the mental support that was needed. So what we decided that, you know, we're gonna create one support group, and that support group is a virtually developed application known by the name of Cosmos. It's the acronym stands for Circle of Strength, master of self. Speakers in these Cosmos sessions, we made a complete setup in the COVID ward, a big TV screen display with an interactive voiceover. And, we were every day evening around 4:30 over the cup of tea. We were bringing some of the patients who were stable enough to come into the lobby. We designated some specific lobbies for that. We kept some board games over there like carom board or cards or chess or whatever, just for a distraction of mind and to take a break up. And the whole idea was just a mental support and making them understand that this is a circle of strength and you need to master it yourself. Just one more thing, if I may be allowed to add on to, which I probably missed during the conversation, was one of the new thing and the positive outcomes of COVID was we learned a lot about technology. We learned a lot that how digitalization and automations can help in such times. And now we are sustaining those solutions. For example, one of my agenda was to how can I limit the entry of the nurse into a COVID positive patient room? How can I reduce that exposure? You know how it happens in the hospital. So there is a nurse called Bell and the patient finds it, very easy to press just one button away and then the nurse comes in. Sometimes we analyzed and realized that some of those nurse calls are irrelevant to nursing. So those calls can also be addressed via an intercom or via a telephone. So one of the agenda that I really wanted to address during this COVID time was how do I limit the exposure of the nurse? And technology played a very big role over there. And thanks to our IT support and again management, we were able to procure a lot of remote monitoring devices. So, 80-85% of the COVID patients don't need any active intervention. They are just supposed to be in the hospital, be on some basic nebulizations and some oxygen support and some antibiotics, but they are not critically ill. But for those who were critically ill, again, we were able to procure some remote monitoring devices wherein we were connecting it to the patient and the nurse can very easily monitor it from the nurse station. Today, the world talks about the nursing profession and what sort of sacrifices it demands. And it is not easy to be in the front line as a warrior when you know that the enemy is so vulnerable and so violent. Then also you put your step forward and say that I'm still fighting this battle because I have chosen consciously and I decided to be a nurse, and that's what my duty calls me for.
And that was Sarah Elias, Chief Nursing Officer at Astor Hospitals. We're going to cross now very quickly to Jane Griffiths, Associate Professor and recently the Chief Nursing Information Officer at the Dubai Health Authority. Afternoon, Jane. I want to throw one quick question at you. On the back of what Brenda just said there, Brenda Flynn from Danat Al Emirat Hospital, she spoke about the importance of breaking down the hierarchies between doctors and nurses at the moment. What did you take from that? How important is that?
I think, well, not only do I think that it's important, because I think that internationally there are probably closer links, I think, between medical staff and nursing staff in this country and in a number of European and Asian countries. There is very much a hierarchy between doctors and nurses, where I think in the West where there's a much closer process and a much more collaborative approach to patient care, then it's quite different. I think the thing that certainly I took away from this time was that when we started to put people or healthcare professionals out into the COVID facilities, we often didn't even know who they were. So we had doctors, we had dentists, we had nursing staff, we had midwives, we had people off the street. And so it was interesting for me to see how everybody suddenly had to work together. And I think that may be one of the interesting take-home messages and side effects of this situation that we've actually been through.
Thank you, Jane. We are going to hear now from Helen King. Helen is Senior Vice President of Quality and the Chief Nurse at NMC Healthcare. Helen's going to tell us what NMC has learned about leadership and about identifying vulnerability during this pandemic.
My name is Helen King, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Nursing and Quality at NMC Healthcare Limited. My role extends across the United Arab Emirates, all Emirates, for nursing, and for quality, it's global. We have learned that people are very resilient, and that nurses particularly are resilient, courageous, and compassionate individuals. There's something about nursing that enables them to adapt quickly. Natural leaders appeared. So those who had been through something previously, possibly a war, or possibly a previous public health disaster, possibly been trained in emergency preparedness, they emerged quite quickly and came to the fore. One of the very important things about crises like this is that leaders should be available. And that is quite exhausting, but leaders should be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And those people who were the people who led. And very quickly, people found out who was available. It's a 24/7, 7 day a week, no end in sight response. So it's trying to maintain well-being in a time of crisis. Personally, I was in the Middle East for the first Gulf War. I was in Saudi Arabia for the first outbreak of coronavirus. And so this is my third time in an emergency situation in the Middle East. And that was very helpful to my organization, I believe. So along with being available, because I think leadership at the front is what's required in situations like this, we also knew our staff. So identify the people who might be more vulnerable in this situation for a number of reasons. It might be a health reason, it might be a family reason, it might be a competence reason. So in the best possible way, and from a human resources management, strategic human resources management point of view, classify the staff. So strategize them in terms of which are the ones who are going to need the most support, which are the ones who can face the front line. We employed an employee assistance program, EAP, through the foresight of our acting CEO now, Michael Davis, and our Chief Human Resources Officer, John O'Connell. We initiated an employee assistance program, and that is available to our staff at any time. And that really, really became a key tenet of maintaining mental well-being during the COVID Wave 1 crisis. The worst aspects are the human aspects. So what I mentioned earlier, exhaustion and continuous response, 24/7, wondering when it's going to end, when it's going to get better. And then for some of the nurse leaders, including myself, being alone. So not having your own family network around you. My family couldn't come because the airports are closed. So in that case, when you are a person alone, and you don't have support around you. And I was very keen to understand who else we had in a leadership position who was in that position. It can be more difficult. So reaching out, connecting, making sure people have contacts, and being there for them is very important, particularly those who did not have a family structure around them here in the UAE. Overwhelmingly, it's been inspirational. And nurses and midwives never cease to amaze me in their ability to respond in a crisis. And it's almost like a built-in element of that role. 24/7, nurses are the people by the bedside. So 24/7, everyone is depending on nurses. The patients, their families, the medical teams, the administrative teams, the leaders, they are the only staff, the only professions who are 24/7 by the bed. So the requirement on nursing, and midwifery, I would say, is heavier than others. And so their ability to respond, become resilient, be courageous, remain compassionate, support one another, never ceased to amaze me throughout the entire of the first wave of COVID.
Thank you. That was Helen speaking to us there, Helen King from NMC Healthcare. Next up, something slightly different. We are going to get the view from the US. We are going to hear now from Karen Busen from OBIX Perinatal Data Systems, and she's speaking to us from Chicago.
My name is Karen Busen. I am the Director of International Sales Support for OBIX Middle East. And I work 50% of the time in the United States and the other 50% of the time in the UAE. I have 35 years experience in labor and delivery nursing, and I have never experienced what we have all experienced during this pandemic. I thought I would give you a perspective of the numbers in the United States. We have had 7.6 million cases of COVID. Globally, I believe it's 29 million. We have had over 200,000 deaths. We just surpassed that this last week. And globally, there has been 1 million deaths. It has been very much underestimated, the power of COVID. It has reached all 50 states and 4 of our territories here. At OBIX, we have a highly skilled, knowledgeable leadership team in our OBIX advisory group. It is comprised of our nurses all across the nation that own and use OBIX, as well as IT people. And we recently had our advisory group meeting, and this year it was virtual, as all meetings are, and we shared a lot of our stories regarding and surrounding the COVID. In New Jersey, one of our customers works at a tertiary hospital of 750 bed. In 2 weeks at the beginning of this crisis, they went to a 550-bed COVID unit. Their ICU increased from 34 beds to 100 beds, and they had at times had over 100 patients on ventilators. So it was fast and furious and described as a war zone, like a mass unit, and all of the staff trying to scramble and work through the changing regulations every day, trying to get enough PPE to protect themselves. And there's a credible amount of fear in that initial outset. Fear of what they were dealing with. Their own staff members were getting ill and dying. A fear of taking it home to their families. So it was a very, very difficult time that we had to navigate. As leaders, we had to quickly create command centers and deal with staffing, how to get more PPE equipment, getting traveling nurses to come in and work there and meet the crisis that we had. Patients dying alone was a very difficult thing for staff to deal with. Their families weren't allowed in. In maternity, they weren't allowed to have a visitor during the most precious time of their life. And in the middle of all this, of trying to navigate through PPE and patient safety and making sure there's enough staffing, patients were coming in on a day-to-day basis to have their babies. And they were afraid. A lot of patients were afraid to come to the hospital to deliver their babies. They thought maybe that they would be separated from their baby. The fear of being alone and not having their loved one there was a very difficult thing. And again, increased the pressure on the caregivers to be that person for them in labor when they're dealing with so much else. Initially, as far as emotional support and mental health support for our caregivers, there just wasn't time in the beginning. But things were rapidly put in place. Some hospitals already had a great psychiatric team, and one had an app that was already in place where healthcare workers could go and actually score themselves and let the app know how they were doing, and then it would kind of guide them, either some things they could do for self-help or get them in touch with counselors and psychiatric care that they needed. And the increase of that app's use went from, minimal to over 800% greater use after COVID pandemic hit. Another thing that we need to embrace is telemedicine. One of our customers uses telemedicine, and in 2019 they had 715 maternity telemedicine visits. Since 2020, January through August of this year, there have been 3,500 telemedicine maternity visits. I'd like to close with a quote from Atul Gawande. He is the author of the Checklist Manifesto. And he says, we are obsessed in medicine with having great components, the best of drugs, the best of devices, the best specialists, but we pay very little attention of how to make them all fit together. In this environment of COVID-19, we have to work together and collaborate. COVID-19 has touched each and every one of us in some way. Keep doing the great work that you are doing in your environments. Communicate, educate, and train your staff. And above all, always do what's right for the patient. Thank you.
That is Karen speaking to us, Karen Busen speaking to us from Chicago. Just a reminder that in around 30 minutes, we are going to be speaking to Jane Griffiths, the recent Chief Nursing Information Officer from the Dubai Health Authority. She will be giving her view of what she has seen happening in terms of support for mental health here in Dubai. And what is happening on the ground, particularly with some of the field hospitals as well. We are going to hear now from Evan Strahl. She is Assistant Director of Nursing at Dubai Hospital. Evan is speaking about the biggest challenges that her hospital has faced in tackling COVID-19.
My name is Evan Strahl. I am the Assistant Director of Nursing at Dubai Hospital. Dubai Hospital is one of the large hospitals that come under the Dubai Health Authority, also known as DHA. I guess I'm speaking about my own hospital at this particular point in time and what we had to deal with very, very quickly. I think the worst thing was, even though we knew it was coming, we weren't prepared. You know, we weren't fully cognizant of how bad it was going to get and how fast that was going to happen. So that was a huge challenge and a huge source of stress, of course, for everybody. So the thing that really saved us was we had a very big and busy neonatal intensive care unit, and we were able to deploy most of our NICU nurses out of the NICU, which thankfully was reasonably quiet at the start of the pandemic. And because they had knowledge of how to use a ventilator, even though they weren't used to looking after adults, they were able to adapt more readily. And without them, we would not have coped as well as we did. What was good was that despite all those challenges, and because of all those challenges, people really stepped up. You know, our staff in this hospital, I can't say enough about them and praise them enough, because they were extraordinary. One of the things we did from the first day where we set up the first COVID unit like this was that we asked the staff to put like a piece of tape on their face shield with their name and their designation. So it would be, you know, charge nurse so-and-so, staff nurse so-and-so, doctor so-and-so. And that at least helped, because they could start to recognise, oh, that's, you know, Fatima, or that's Jenny, or and start to be able to know each other's names, which is very important. And it also meant the patients knew the names of the people and the designation of the people caring for them. It was something very simple, but it really assisted in communication. The other thing was that we worked with our clinical psychologists within the hospital to set up some support services for staff, as well as patients, of course, and the mental health issues that are arising, you know, are very serious. I've been able to speak with all of the charge nurses and all of the supervisors in our hospital, and we are on alert for any staff that are struggling, and we've identified a couple that post-COVID have had some issues, and we've been able to steer them into some counselling services. I'm so grateful to my staff for that level of humanity and that level of kindness, you know, to each other, and particularly to the patients, because COVID patients are incredibly lonely. You know, they often have nobody, you know, and we wanted to make sure that they didn't feel alone. And I'm sure we didn't always succeed, but you know, we tried our very best under the circumstances. We're also very aware that they're tired. They're tired physically, they're tired emotionally, they're tired spiritually. And so a lot of the work that we do as leaders in the organisation is talking to people, keeping that communication open, allowing them to vent, allowing them to tell us how frustrated they are. There's nothing much we can do about it, unfortunately, at the moment, but we can listen. You know, we can offer that same level of kindness and companionship that they gave to the patients during the crisis. And I think that that's terribly important at the moment. There are lots of lessons to be learned, practical ones, systemic ones, you know, how we set up organisations and processes and equipment and all of those things. But in it all, and I think it's the importance of this seminar today, is the absolute need for us never to forget, as nurses and midwives, as healthcare professionals, that the basis of what we do is our head, our heart and our hands in combination. And our head can be as smart as we like, and our hands can be as competent as we like, but if our heart isn't in it, if we aren't caring for each other, caring for ourselves, caring for our patients, and remembering to be kind to everyone, and that includes ourselves, we have no capacity to do this job properly. And I would just encourage everyone to remember, if you can be anything, be kind.
And that was Evan Stroud, Director of Nursing at Dubai Hospital. I'm going to cross now to Karen O'Boyle because we've had a couple of questions that pick up on something that Evan was talking about there, and that was identifying struggling staff. Of course, not everybody shows their struggles in the same way. And Karen, if you're there, I was wondering what some of the less obvious signs leaders should be looking for are.
Thanks very much, Brandy. I thought that was a wonderful piece there by Avon. You know, head, heart and hands, I thought it was wonderful. Yeah, I think leaders know their people, you know, and good leaders, authentic leaders, transformational leaders spend a great deal of time thinking about their people as individuals. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's actually individualization of approach is central to transformational leadership. So I think that's the first thing. And then you're looking for changes, really, changes in behaviors. You're watching for people maybe not doing well, something that's maybe out of the ordinary. People looking tired. Irritability is a very common source or symptom of people being a little bit more stressed. But other people can go very silent, can go very quiet. And I think the challenge in leadership is you never know what else is going on for that person. You know, you don't know how the situation is landing with them. You don't know what memories it's bringing up. You don't necessarily know what else is going on in their lives. And I think nursing is one of those professions where, you know, there's a wonderful focus on what Evan just described there as head, heart and hands, but particularly on heart. So I think once the leader has an open heart, you know, the signs are going to be there, and it's a matter of becoming much more sensitive to those signs. And the final thing I'd say about that, Brandy, I think there's a model of leadership that's very common in healthcare, and that's heroic leadership, that one person is in charge and everybody follows. Well, I think we have a lot of evidence to show that that's not really the best model of leadership, that a distributed model of leadership is more effective in these complex environments. And that means that leadership is everybody's job, not just the isolated leader at the top. I think it was somebody was speaking, I don't remember who, Brenda maybe, or Sarah, I think, was speaking about, the loneliness of that. But I think the extent to which the leadership can be distributed within the team is incredibly important in supporting everybody. So not only then do I, as an individual, I'm not just receiving inputs and direction. I'm actually contributing, and I'm changing my view of myself that I can contribute to leadership.
Thank you very much, Karen. Next on our agenda, we're going to hear from Alta de Villiers, who is Director of Education and Training at NMC Healthcare. A slightly different take here to talk about the training challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up.
I'm Alta de Villiers. I'm the Director for Education and Training for the NMC Healthcare Group. When COVID-19 was starting, we kind of went slow into realizing that we need to change the way that we think about education. And then it hit us actually kind of with a bang, because things just escalated quite fast. And the challenges we faced, that suddenly we couldn't get to our nurses anymore that needed training. And the training needs that they were requiring were totally different from what we've identified before. It was also a challenge for us as an education centre and as trainers in the education centre that we didn't know anything about COVID-19. So we had to kind of educate ourselves before we could go and educate the nurses on what to do. And I think the biggest challenges were on the forefront for the nursing staff and the doctors that were facing these patients on a daily basis in the front line. They were exposed to all of this. We were kind of in the back, not so much exposed to it, but we had to deal with the nursing staff and the physicians that were exposed to this day to day. So you had a lot of challenges within their emotional status, together with learning them and what is the right techniques to do to make sure that they are safe. The way that we used to traditionally give education from an NMC was that we would really have face-to-face close contact to all our staff, and we would train them in classroom training setups. We would go to them and have one-to-one face-to-face training, which was now suddenly not possible. We were not allowed to go into the hospitals to do training. They could not come to us. In groups were definitely not allowed, so we couldn't do training in big groups. So we've started with Microsoft Teams. We found a really good platform where we could deliver online training by giving the hospitals devices where they could then get it from the units, and they could then sit together in one or two at a time, where we could then give the training to them if they didn't have the options to do it from home. So we also went around with the hospitals and we made videos for the hospitals together with the hospital staff. We would train them on like how to wear PPE, how to don, how to doff, those kind of things that are practical. The emotional challenges, the stress management, these were good and great challenges that the nurses faced every day. So we really had to face that as well. And we had great assistance from our corporate office, where they offered trainings, and we offered some telephone calls to the nurses that were identified that were stressed. They had an open line. We've set up a line for them that they could phone somebody specifically that was there to support the nurses in any kind of issue that they faced, whether it was stress related, whether they had family issues, whether they had financial issues during this time. They could have it was like a helpline that we set up for them. I think the greatest lessons we've learned from COVID-19 pandemic is that we can change very easily. And I think I can just commend nurses. 2020 was the year of the nurse announced before COVID-19 pandemic was announced. And I don't think anybody realized how much 2020 would become the year of the nurse. And it actually showcased the nurse and how important nursing is, and that we should never forget the work of a nurse in any situation. That nurses, nobody could have done this without the nursing force that we had. And I think we should just commend all the nurses for this great job that they did during this time and still continue to do. They didn't stop, they didn't wink, they didn't complain, they just went on and they got on with the work that was expected of them.
Next, we're going to get the view from the Northern Emirates. Sue Aiken is the Chief Nursing Officer at Ras Al Khaimah Hospital.
Hello everyone, I'm Sue Aiken and I'm the Chief Nursing Officer at RAC Hospital. I've been in the Emirates for 35 plus years. So I spent my time in Al Ain at Tuam Hospital, and then I moved to Dubai where I was the ADON at Dubai Hospital. We've always had a very flat structure leadership-wise in our hospital where the senior executive are very accessible to everybody. Our CEO, who's also a doctor, and myself do rounds every day anyway. I don't see that changing afterwards, and in fact having that relationship with our staff I think has helped us during this time, because people know that if they have an issue they can come and speak to us straight away. They can stop us as we're walking around the hospital. We're always available, and we have a very open door policy, so I personally go around the wards every single day and speak to the staff as much as possible. I'm back in scrubs, as you can see, going out from business wear attire, and I'm actually involved with the staff, helping them. I'm also part of the screening team going out. In fact, I'm leading the screening team. So we're involving our staff. They can come to my office at any time. The nurse managers are empowered very much to give, if someone needs time off, let them go home early a little bit. The rules are quite relaxed at the moment, as long as obviously the job is done. So some of the leadership aspects and some of the things that we brought in, we've developed leadership teams. We have team meetings every day now. Previously we would have them in person, now we have them on Microsoft Teams. We've got special groups that deal with things, so we've got crisis teams, and okay, this is for a pandemic, for COVID, but there can be other things as well. So we've got teams that can identify together and very, very quickly come together, to get things moving. We've got supports. We have a psychologist in our hospital who is now involved with all the staff, so anybody that needs to see her, she's available to see staff as well if they may be going through a bit of a hard time, not seeing their families, or maybe if they're positive, for example, they've tested positive. Okay, they're isolated, but they can still speak with a psychologist on board. One good thing that we set up is we have a COVID rehabilitation program, and it's running for our staff so that people come back to work after testing positive for COVID, and it's like all hands on deck again. But there's still some underlying maybe conditions or symptoms, maybe mentally as well, that they have to go through. So we set up this COVID rehabilitation program for the staff, and so after a couple of weeks they come in, they see the doctor, we do some more baselines, they go to physio, they do a few exercises, they meet with a psychologist, have a chat with her, and just make sure that they're actually coping as they've come back to work. We did try to split the hospital into teams so that we could work in 2 groups, which was fine for admin, but didn't really work for medical teams because we all had to be here. I think nurses are very resilient and they rose to the challenge anyway. So while we could say it was worst points, but to be honest, everybody rose to it, and it's a challenge, and our staff were amazing. Some of the most inspiring aspects is the hospital has come together as a team. Obviously, hospital is a team anyway, but the teamwork has increased just so much. Everybody's working together now. The billing staff are supporting the nursing staff are supporting the housekeeping staff. It's just everybody has really, really come together, pulled together to make everything work. When there's a crisis, we just get in there and really work and do it. So that, to me, has been one of the most amazing things. It's really brought the hospital staff really much closer together. Everybody knows each other now, and everybody is really, really working and pulling together to be one group, one cohesive group. Obviously, people can't get home to their home countries, and unfortunately, some have had relatives that have been sick and even passed away. So we've done our very best to support these people. We've let them have their kind of morning leave here. We've made sure that the counsellors have been working with these people just to, to ensure that they're, obviously if a relative dies, it's very, very heartbreaking, and it's even worse if you can't actually get home to be with the rest of the family. So our ecologist is working very hard with these people. Obviously we have a mix of different nationalities here, so we've got groups that will support each other. Lessons that we can take from this, I think, first of all, is always being prepared for whatever's going to hit us next. Who knows what's going to come next? So we need to be prepared. So training, education, ensuring that we've got the right skill mix, that we've got the right equipment, that we've got the right consumables needed to do our job, being adaptable to anything at the drop of a hat. I am typically a very kind of upbeat person. I'm a very motivated person anyway. I'm very passionate about my job, especially about leadership and especially about my nurses. I guess one of the ways that I stay motivated at work is by having a kind of social life outside. Obviously, it's a little bit different now, but I do exercise, I do walk. I'm lucky enough to live in a place where I've got access to the beach, to the sea, so actually having some kind of home life, balancing a little bit with work life, I think is very, very important. I'm here at 7:30 to take report from the night staff. It's just the way I do things. I think when you're a nurse, you're so used to getting up early and being at work that staying home till 9 o'clock is just not me. I have to be here, meet the nurses, meet the managers, take the report from the night staff, and here all day. First in, first out, I guess.
That is Sue Aiken, Chief Nursing Officer at Ras Al Khaimah Hospital. Our final speaker today needs no introduction to the majority of you, but I'm going to give you one anyway. She is Associate Professor Jane Griffiths. Jane is the recent Chief Nursing Information Officer at the Dubai Health Authority. She's also Chair of the UAE Nursing and Midwifery Council Scientific Committee for Research and Excellence. She's been based in the UAE since 2007, and we're very lucky to have her with us today to give us her view of how Dubai has tackled this pandemic and what has been done on the ground to support frontline nursing staff. Jane, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Bear with me. For those of you who know me very well, you know just how terrible I am with technology, so hang on just 2 seconds. This is my favourite slide. And I often wonder whether or not I was the cause of COVID, because we were celebrating a particular activity at my work, and I said, this was in February, and I said to the baker, put a COVID bug on top of the cake that we were actually doing, so it became a COVID cake. And from that moment onwards, I now use it on every slide. So it's a bit dodgy, but it gives you an indication of the fact that we had no idea what was actually going to happen back in February. The timeline of activities, and this graph at the back of you will give you an indication of what that timeline looks like here. And basically what we went through was 2020 started off all right. For me personally, it was going to be a much better year for me, because last year my father died, and I spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards between the UAE and Australia, looking after him. And so I thought 2020 is going to be much, much better. And then all hell broke loose. And we then started to face, as Kieran quite rightly said, the biggest issue of the 21st century, and one that has never affected everybody before. And I think that that's a really important issue. As I said, I come from Australia. Australia, the land down under, a long way away from everywhere else in the world, which tends to make us much more secure, and we can pretend whatever is happening in the rest of the world doesn't actually affect us. And that didn't happen this time. It doesn't matter where you came from. Every single country in the world has been affected by this particular situation. And every one of us has been affected personally. So it doesn't matter whether or not you're a healthcare professional. Every person knows somebody who has who's contracted COVID. They know somebody who's died from COVID, somebody who's been left with significant comorbidities going forward as a result of COVID. Some people have lost their jobs. Some people are now homeless. All of these issues have never affected the world in its completeness before. It affects certain countries previously, but it hasn't affected all of us. And now this situation that we are facing and continue to face is affecting all of us. Our first case came back in the beginning of February, and then all of a sudden, as I said, all hell broke loose. What I want to talk about is not only, and what I'm trying to do is to actually give you hard evidence about what our healthcare professionals here have actually faced. I come from an electronic medical record and an operational type background. Involved a lot of planning on both disasters throughout my career. So for me, this was an absolute indication of what was potentially going to happen and what we needed to do about it. But I want to bring home to you some of the enormous issues that healthcare professionals and our community have actually faced. If we start to look at, sort of what's actually happened, a number of people have already spoken about the fact that a lot of people now started to work in different roles. I alluded before to the fact that when we started to set up some of our COVID facilities, we couldn't tell the difference as to who was actually working there, because we had actually dragged people out of, sort of their nursing role, out of their medical role, out of their dental role. Evan referred to the fact that neonatal intensive care nurses had suddenly become ICU nurses. As I said, we had dentists that were, well, I thought were respiratory physicians until they went to place medication orders and all of a sudden found out that they weren't actually licensed to be able to do that. We've got situations where, though it made me smile, I actually felt quite sorry for them. All of a sudden we had dermatologists that were actually being asked to be respiratory physicians. And you can imagine the absolute horror of that, together with my fabulous orthopaedic colleagues who, in their terms, have not used a stethoscope since they were interns, suddenly being put into these sorts of situations. We had midwives who suddenly had to work in general ward areas looking after COVID-positive patients when normally they will look after healthy women and babies. All of these sorts of things have changed not only their work, but also their confidence, all of those sorts of issues around, sort of I am a competent, I'm an intelligent, I'm a skilled practitioner in X, and all of a sudden I've been put in Y, and I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't understand the equipment that I'm facing. I don't understand what the normal processes are. I can remember going into the trade centre at one point in time and talking to a nurse who'd come out of primary healthcare, and I was talking to her about the Muse score, which is like the early warning system as far as vital signs are concerned. She looked at me blankly and she said, I don't even know what that means. And so we were suddenly facing a situation where our staff were put in a situation where they were so uncomfortable. They'd also been involved in very hazardous situations. And all of a sudden now they're facing risks from the pathogen itself. They're facing the risks of long working hours, of fatigue, of burnout, and of the declining mental health status of themselves. And all of this, everybody has spoken about this afternoon, because the issue we've got is how on earth do you manage in a situation that nobody else has had to manage before? I was in Australia and then here when SARS and H1N1 started. So I was in Australia with SARS and here with H1N1. And we dealt with that because it was controlled. It wasn't the entire population. And sure, we had fever hospitals and things like that, but they were single facilities, and that process was controlled. Now it's not. All of a sudden we've got a situation where we had to stop things like elective surgery so that we could actually have the facilities and have the staff to look after people who are coming in that were COVID positive. Our staff, it was stressful enough. Our staff, on the other hand, were also stressed because of exacerbation of the virus in their patients. We started off with everybody at the beginning of the year saying this is like the flu, until everybody started to drop dead, until 25% of our patients that were in intensive care with COVID ended up with kidney failure and had to be dialysed. All of a sudden, you know, sort of they would end up with cardiomyopathy. This disease was actually affecting whole systems that had nothing to do with influenza. And we were having people who were having limbs amputated, who were stroking out, who were, as I said, in liver failure and kidney failure, something that we had never seen before in an influenza virus. And our patients, as well as our staff, were also facing declining mental health issues. We had patients who were succeeding and attempting to succeed in committing suicide just because they thought they had COVID or because they actually got a positive diagnosis. That is a terrifying thing for both patients to be that anxious, that depressed, that scared, but it's also terrifying for our staff because often our staff don't recognise the symptoms because they're not used to dealing with mental health or with depressive illnesses or with people who are actually attempting to self-harm themselves. Within this region, there are limited acute mental health services. And so if we look within DHA, for instance, we have one of our facilities that deals with acute mental health. If you have a patient who presents with an acute psychotic episode in one of our other facilities, they will be transferred. How do we deal with that when people are coming in off the street and our staff are then not only having to try and diagnose and to help treat, but often don't even realise it's happening, and then when there is an adverse outcome that occurs, are then guilt-ridden as associated with that. That is terrifying, and it's terrifying for our leadership, and it's terrifying for this country because we are now having to face those sorts of issues. And we need to make sure that will be one of the positive outcomes of this disease is the fact that we now start to refocus on the mental health issues, not only for our staff, but also for our community. So, what do we actually do? For those of you who are not familiar with the Dubai Health Authority, it is the government healthcare facilities for the Emirate of Dubai. And listed on the wall there is our facilities, and they're clearly varied, so that you have hospitals, you have primary healthcare centres, you have medical fitness, you have specialty centres, you have the public health units, you have the licensing and regulation authorities, so all of that comes under that umbrella of the Dubai Health Authority. I want to talk to you now about what staff, and it wasn't only staff within DHA, it was staff supported by our private sector colleagues. So we added 17,000 plus additional beds to the original 2,000 beds that were in the Dubai Health Authority. And this came about through taking over hotels as well as taking over newly built health facilities. What happened was that, fortuitously, there were a number of labour camps that were almost being completed in the desert. And so at what was called then Wasan and Al Raqba were two very large labour camps. And what we had the opportunity of doing through very generous donations of the people who owned those facilities was to be able to take them over and turn them into healthcare facilities, to be able to isolate those patients who were either were mildly symptomatic and so therefore could be isolated. If I can give you an example of Wasan, that we had 25 buildings there. Each building took 524 patients. I mean, like, that's a huge number of people. And the thing that absolutely, I think, did my head in more than anything else was that some of this additional build to actually complete not only these facilities, but also to turn them into things like negative pressure were undertaken with less than 24 hours notice. I mean, I've been here for a long time, and in that period of time, I've attempted to actually build a lot of facilities, and I've never managed to actually build negative pressure wards and units and so forth in 7 to 10 days. I mean, I've never seen that happen, and our engineering colleagues managed to pull that off. 16 hotels were used as either isolation or quarantine facilities, and that amounted to 7,000 beds. We had the trade centre set up as to treat patients who required isolation that presented with mild or moderate symptoms. The field hospital itself, which is what it was called at the trade centre, was actually built to be able to accommodate 3,000 patients, and fortunately we never had to actually activate the whole lot of that. But to give you some indication of what this actually looks like, is that this first picture here is the first hotel that we converted. And I can remember being called out on a Friday morning to go and actually do the inspection of that particular hotel. And when I walked in, there were regular paying guests at the reception counter. And I said to the manager, I said, "Who are these people?" And he said, "Oh, they're guests." And I said, "What are they doing?" And he said, "Oh, we're moving them to a sister hotel." And I can remember feeling guilty enough about that actually happening, and yet we continued. The middle picture is of the field hospital at the trade centre, and this is the infamous Wasan facility. It's now called the Hinged Humanitarian City, and it seriously is a city. It is an extraordinary achievement for the people who both built it and for the people who then continued to run it. The additional beds that we actually built within our DHA facilities or converted within our DHA facilities also amounted to over 500 beds, so that we converted 306 beds into negative pressure rooms and added an additional 200-odd intensive care beds. That, when you listen to the directors of nursing talking about what their staff did, is again no mean achievement, because clearly we don't have the same situation that they do in the US or in the UK or even in Australia, where you can actually call for a pool nurse, or you can get an agency nurse to come and actually work, or you can get your part-timers to work extra hours, because none of those creatures actually exist in this part of the world. So, you know, sort of we absolutely relied on our private sector colleagues to be able to provide support and to be able to provide staff. A number of the facilities, the directors of nursing who spoke this afternoon, work for companies that actually bought nursing staff in from overseas to help us during this particular difficult time. But apart from our inpatient facilities, we also went through a significant amount of change in our outpatient settings. So again, there are very small benefits of this particular disease, very small, and I recognise that. But one of the significant ones was around telemedicine. And this has been evidenced throughout the entire world. Everybody has been very suspicious, very nervous, and very reluctant to adopt telemedicine. I come from Australia, which is a land of a huge amount of miles, and telemedicine has been used in that country for a long time because we can't get healthcare workers in some of those remote areas. But within our cities, we face exactly the same challenges. COVID has actually given us an opportunity to absolutely boost that technology from both a legal perspective as well as from how we actually work this as far as our healthcare professionals are concerned and our patients are concerned. Our Doctor for Every Citizen telemedicine program that was started in 2019, pre-COVID was seeing 100 to 200 patients a month. Post-COVID, they were seeing 7,500 people a month. And that was just for like GP type work. What we also managed to do was to actually expand and roll out that process to our specialist services. So it meant that if you need to see a specialist, then there was a good chance that we could actually set that up. Now, everybody said to us, this is not going to work. And we've had some surprising stories about how well it's worked. And the interesting thing for me is particularly with our elderly population, where everybody said they can't use technology. And I got to tell you, our elderly population may or may not be able to use the technology, but they've certainly got people around them who can. But what it saves them is trying to actually struggle to get into a healthcare facility, to sit and wait for a physician for a long time in a waiting room. If they can do that from the comfort of their own home, then they're absolutely delighted. So that's a really important issue. It also has given us an opportunity to be able to use SMSs in both Arabic and English, giving instructions to patients post-swabbing, so that, sort of if they've had a swab done, then again, that means that they get a message in less than 24 hours that tells them whether they're positive or negative and what needs to happen next. And for our community, that's unbelievably important because they're scared. And you get scared more if you don't know what's actually going on. So the communication for both our staff and our patients is unbelievably important. We also managed to do setting up of the drive-through screening places and the walk-in screening places. So here you're actually seeing up here the drive-through, which is unbelievably neat, and it's like doing, sort of you stay in your car, you put your Emirates ID into a little machine that looks like a credit card reader. It takes all of the details, and the nurse comes out or the doctor comes out and sticks a stick up your nose and off you go. It's a very efficient service, as well as the walk-in screening processes, which is the second one here, which have been set up in areas like indoor basketball courts. So it's been a very nice situation. The technology's also helped us because of the things like we now can get the dashboards that can tell us what sort of patients we're seeing, what sort of numbers we're seeing, and whether or not we're on top of what we actually need to deal with. Our documentation has allowed us, we were very fortunate to be able to rapidly put in additional help for our clinical staff by putting alerts into the system. So, sort of to remind people that they needed to ask whether or not somebody's travelled, whether or not they've been exposed to anybody, all of those sorts of things allowed us to be able to deal potentially with patients who may be infective. It also allowed us to put in some particular infection control and infectious diseases components into our electronic medical record, which again allowed us to not only track patients, but also allowed us to implement after visit summaries for patients going home or after they've seen a physician, either through telemedicine or in person, about what they needed to do next. If we look at some of the information, the auto-infection updates occurred automatically within the system. So if you opened up a patient's medical record, you knew exactly what their infection status was, and you could trace both patients, caregivers, as well as the beds. So what we were trying to do was to make it as easy as possible for our staff, because clearly we want to actually stop that from actually occurring. Over 1,200 additional volunteers, overseas staff, police and ambulance staff were trained in how to actually use the electronic medical record, because they were actually brought in to help in our COVID facilities. We had 2,100 additional staff and staff who changed their role to be able, and they were given access to the system as well. And we developed additional tip sheets so that it meant that it was easy for them to be able to understand what they had to do as far as the system goes. Life goes on though, and now what we need to do is to focus on identifying and treating the anxiety, depression and suicidal thoughts of all of our presenting patients. And that's scary. And it's scary for not only our patients, but it's also scary for our staff. There are new models of care that are being implemented as far as contactless care, so the home monitoring, through that includes vital sign capturing and tracking of how patients actually are without them having to actually come in. And telemedicine, as I said before, is not only seen as the future, it's actually seen as now. Our patient-provider communications have been supplemented with things like SMSs, videos, all of those sorts of things to try and actually make life not only easy and more comfortable for both staff and patients, but it's also giving both sides some degree of contact. Because, as a couple of our previous speakers have said, the scariest thing that you've got is if you become isolated and you don't have that sort of contact. I mentioned at the very beginning that for me 2019 was terrible because of my father's death. I've got to tell you right now, I'm unbelievably grateful that he died in 2019 because it meant that I could be with him. I've dealt with a number of our staff who have not been as fortunate, where they have family overseas that have either become gravely ill or who've actually died and they've not been able to be with them. This has certainly been a steep learning curve for all of us. We need to make sure that our front staff are recognised. They have been amazing. They have been risking their own lives and those of their families. Some of our colleagues have contracted the disease. Some of them have lost their lives. The focus now must be on supporting both staff and patients to recover safely, both physically as well as mentally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your generosity there in sharing your own story with your father. We've got about 2 minutes left, and I just have one question for you to tie up almost everything that we have heard today. And it's a how question. You said there that what we need to do now is we need to support our nursing staff. And from a mental health point of view, from an emotional point of view, from a preventing burnout point of view. What, with all of your experience, what do you want to see happen next to do that here in Dubai?
I think, and please let us all recognise that I am no longer employed by DHA as a starting point, because what I might say, and my colleague sitting next to me just moved away, so he's clearly scared. We have to recognise that this is an issue. We have to start to look at providing more mental health services, to recognise that having a mental health issue is no different from having a broken leg. It is an illness. It is something that we all need to take responsibility for. And we need to provide the clinical services to be able to do that. You know, sort of if I look at my colleagues across this region, I'm not even talking about the UAE, I'm talking about the region. Mental health issues have been seen as evil jinn stuff. That it's not necessarily a recognised disease and nobody wants to talk about it and it's hidden away. We need to recognise that it is no different from any other disease process, that everybody is going to face a depressive cycle at some time in their life, and when that happens, we need to make sure that they can make choices to actually get help. And to do that, we need to have more than one psychologist in a facility. We need to be able to have a situation where our nursing staff actually do have some mental health training, that they do have ongoing education and support, not only for themselves, but so that they can actually look after their patients and recognise when they need additional help. And it's not only our nursing staff. Our physician colleagues are facing exactly the same thing. As I said before, my orthopaedic friends used a stethoscope the last time when they were an intern. I don't think that they ever did anything as far as mental health was concerned. And they're unbelievably good at fixing bones, but that's what they focus on. They don't focus on anything else. If a patient presented to them with a mental health problem, unless they were floridly psychotic, they probably wouldn't recognise it. They also need that training and support, as do all of the healthcare industry here within this region.
Jane, thank you very much. That's a fantastic note and a thought-provoking note to end on. We're going to wrap up now. Keeping to time, as promised, from the Nurse Leadership Forum Middle East, which has come to you from OBIX Middle East. I have to say a number of thanks. Associate Professor Jane Griffiths, first off, thank you for your time and sharing your expertise with us. Professor Karen O'Boyle joining us today from Dublin. All of our nurse leaders on the steering group, including those who shared their experiences with us today, Brenda Flynn from Danat Al Emirat, Sarah Ilias from Aster, Helen King and Alfred de Villiers from MNC, Karen Booston from OBIX, Arvin Strahl from Dubai Hospital, and Sue Aitken from Ras Al Khaimah RAC Hospital. We hope all of you listening have gained from this experience. I know that I've learned a lot today particularly, and it's made me think of actually a saying that we're using in my organisation and my team at the moment, which is we're just imagining that everyone's got an invisible 20-kilogram backpack that they're carrying around with them at the moment. And you can't see it, and everyone's got something different in it, but it's there. So we're wishing you a safe journey during these challenging times, and we're looking forward to working with you all again at the next Nurse Leadership Forum. Thank you very much for joining us today.